This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 54 of Here's How. In this episode, I'm looking again at how RTE defended the independence of their journalists and how proposed EU laws could undermine independent websites and hit them with taxes and bureaucracy that could put them out of business.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
You might remember in episode 41 I talked to RTE's news planner Donal Byrne about news values at the national station. It was a pretty testy interview, particularly when I talked about RTE's crime journalist Paul Reynolds. Paul Reynolds has been in the news lately, perhaps not for the reasons he would wish. He seems to be missing in action from RTE microphones while we're in the thick of the biggest crime story in years, the organised smearing of Garda whistleblower Maurice McCabe. A wide range of comment, particularly on social media, about Paul Reynolds, and he's certainly had, outside of RTE, negative comment about his level of independence from the Gardaí. Paul Reynolds is RTE's main crime reporter. He has strong family links to the Gardaí. His father was... This is some of the exchange between myself and Reynolds' boss, Donal Byrne. I feel that his reporting and his prominence in crime reporting is at a sufficient arm's length from the Gardaí.
Firstly, William, I have an issue with identifying Paul Reynolds' family as being, it seems to me you're suggesting that there is a pro-Garda factor at work here. I'm sure you're aware I'm not the only one. Paul Reynolds has been for many years an outstanding crime reporter and whose work seldom has ever been called into question. He deals every day with quite extraordinary stories that reflect the nature of what's happening in our society under huge pressure. And he's one of the people, he's just an example of the kind of journalist and the kind of journalism that we produce that is fair.
When I asked this question of Donal Byrne, I was thinking particularly of a set-up interview that Paul Reynolds did on RTE on the 9th of May last year. The piece was about the O'Higgins Commission report. This was the report that was set up to look into what Sergeant Maurice McCabe had been saying about corruption and incompetence in the Garda Síochána. There is a basic principle in PR and news management of getting your dig in first. When a story comes out, the first version that people hear is usually the one that sticks. So that's why when a story breaks, politicians and others race to get their spin out first. Journalists know this and they exploit this. They can get a leak or a scoop from a source who has an interest in giving their side of the story before anyone else. So they're motivated to leak any advance copy they get. It's a simple bargain. The source gets their version aired first, and the journalist gets to steal a march on their competition. But there's an ethical line here. It's one thing for the journalist to give the facts along with the source's interpretation. But if a journalist gets the information by promising the source to give the public an inaccurate impression of the facts, that's a very serious breach of journalistic ethics. And if a journalist was found to have collaborated together with a source to give a skewed impression of the facts, then any decent news organisation would fire that journalist in a heartbeat. Here's what we know about the O'Higgins report. It was commissioned by Enda Kenny from retired High Court Judge Kevin O'Higgins in February 2015. The judge heard from almost 100 witnesses to establish what was going on with a dossier of malpractice that Sergeant Maurice McCabe had compiled. We now know that, at this time, journalists were being briefed with accusations that Maurice McCabe was nothing but an embittered crank who was making up stories to cover his own incompetence, and that he was guilty of everything under the sun, including being a child molester. Judge O'Higgins sent his report to the Minister of Justice on the 25th of April 2016. It's clear that the Garda authorities got a copy then, if not before. There was then more than a 2-week delay while public pressure mounted to have the report published, and it was finally published on the 11th of May last year. But before it was published, it was leaked to Paul Reynolds, timed to allow him to report on it on the 9th of May, just 2 days before the publication. The report was 350 pages long. On the whole, the report concluded that Maurice McCabe was entirely correct to complain about malpractice in the Garda Síochána. It concluded that he was a dedicated officer whose complaints were motivated by a desire to improve the force. That wasn't quite the impression you would have got if you listened to Paul Reynolds' report. Like any long document, it's possible to trawl through it and pull out quotes that misrepresent the thrust of the document as a whole. Have a listen to this clip. I've pulled out many of the times that Reynolds refers to McCabe.
It does say he was a dedicated and committed member of the Gardaí, but prone to exaggeration. And there were also other cases that were proven to be overstated, exaggerated, unfounded, and that were ultimately withdrawn at the Commission. No, the Commission says that Sergeant McCabe accused the former Garda Commissioner of corruption. It also says, quote, he did not withdraw the allegation against the Commissioner despite being invited to do so. But it says that the former Commissioner, quote, is vindicated.
Does the report indicate why Sergeant McCabe wrongly accused the Commissioner of corruption?
Sergeant McCabe made numerous allegations against Superintendent Clancy in the report, none of which were upheld. There is not a scintilla of evidence to support an allegation of any type of corruption against the former Commissioner. And it states at least 19 times that Sergeant McCabe's complaints against Superintendent Clancy were inaccurate, unreasonable, incorrect, manifestly unfounded, or, quote, not supported by the facts. These allegations are without foundation. They were categorised as unjustified criticism. Sergeant McCabe made allegations against a former commissioner, a serving assistant commissioner, a retired chief superintendent, a superintendent and an inspector. In each case, unfounded, have had to live for many years under the strain of those allegations. The report also highlights inaccuracies and exaggerations made by Sergeant McCabe. The Commission says this assertion is not borne out. Incorrect and inaccurate, and it rejected the Sergeant's claim, and the Commission found that it was incorrect to state that no investigation was ever done. Those complaints were dismissed. The Commission, however, was satisfied there was no evidence of crime.
I have a link to the original interview on the RTE website if you want to hear the full thing. But even RTE's Philip Boucher-Hayes got a dig in at his colleague the next day. That audio, though, is mysteriously missing from the RTE website, but he pointed out that the judge's report said that Sergeant McCabe, quote, this is a quotation from the report, Sergeant McCabe was an officer who acted out of genuine, legitimate concern, and, another quotation, he was never less than truthful in his evidence. That's not quite the impression you would have got from Reynolds' report. The draft terms of reference for the public inquiry into the smearing of Maurice McCabe include, at item G, to investigate whether Commissioner Noreen O'Sullivan, using briefing material prepared in Garda headquarters, planned and orchestrated broadcasts on RTE on the 9th of May 2016, purporting to be a leaked account of the unpublished O'Higgins Commission report, in which Sergeant McCabe was branded a liar and irresponsible.
Paul Reynolds has been for many years an outstanding crime reporter and whose work seldom has ever been called into question.
I'm not quite sure that's true anymore.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On a Skype line now, I have Ruth Kustik-Deal. She is a digital rights campaigner with Open Media. Ruth, what exactly is Open Media?
Hi, yes, so Open Media is an international campaigning organisation on digital rights, and we focus on making sure that the internet is accessible, affordable, open, and surveillance-free.
I know that Günther Oettinger is the German European Commissioner. He's a member of Angela Merkel's CDU party, and he is leaving his post shortly, but he has been proposing two things that you've been campaigning against. One of them is what you're calling the link tax. Can you tell me very briefly what is proposed there?
Yeah, so the link tax is an idea to give publishers, big news publishers in the EU, a copyright over linking. So this started off actually as an idea to give themselves copyright ownership over hyperlinks themselves. And when that idea got toxic, they adapted it a little bit. But ultimately, it doesn't change how it works, which is that they want to give themselves this ownership over the little short snippets of text that you get when you share a link.
Okay, I should explain this a little bit. The hyperlink itself is the HTTP thing with slashes and dots and so forth.
Exactly. Sorry.
Before, maybe when we posted this in earlier versions of software, you would just see that HTTP text with perhaps a blue underline or a coloured underline, and when you clicked on it, you would go through to the page. In more modern systems, such as message boards and on WhatsApp or whatever, if you post that, it will automatically interrogate the website at the other end, and it'll pick up the plain text title of the page and sometimes even a couple of lines of text. You see this in Facebook. Now, as I understand it, you can't copyright a fact. So if I say that Christmas is on December 25th, even if I put a copyright symbol on that, or even if I say it first, nobody can be held up for repeating that because it's a simple fact. But when you create something, that is copyrightable. And previously it's been held that the link itself is a fact. It's just the address of a page. But isn't the snippet, say for example, when I post a link in Facebook, I see a snippet from that text. That text is copyrightable, isn't it?
It is. However, the link itself shouldn't be, and they're trying to claim ownership over the way that links are used, and they're using this ownership of the text in order to give themselves ownership of the links. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the text itself should be owned by the author, the creator of the work, not the publishing company. And what they want to do is give themselves this additional copyright in order to control how links can be shared and used. And although they also, through other copyrights, often do own the text, there's also a right to make quotations, and this copyright idea is trying to get rid of that idea. This is just a short title, just one line of text, and they're trying to gain this right so that then they can, ultimately why we call this a link tax, charge fees for sharing the links. And it's really just a method to try and make money where their business model isn't failing and trying to really come up with a whole new business model, which is selling links.
You're probably correct that traditional newspapers, certainly I've seen a graph in the UK since the year 2000, the total daily newspaper sales have more than halved, and they're not really making much money online. But Facebook is making a lot of money from news stories. A lot of the news I see is on Facebook. Isn't it fair that Facebook, who's a vastly profitable company, should be contributing towards the expensive content that brings them their readers?
I think that there possibly are other ways that they could do that. I think it's a really interesting idea to have Facebook contribute more in other ways. Perhaps they could perform grants, or they could do more direct paying for authors. Mm-hmm. But this method is much more problematic than that, because it's targeting what is basically the infrastructure of the internet, which is the link. Like, it's the kind of fundamental building block of what made the web work. It's what Tim Berners-Lee invented. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of using this idea of trying to get a working business model in a difficult time to attack the basic infrastructure. And it's just a really terrible way of working it. And also, it hasn't actually worked in practice, to be honest. They tried this already in Germany and in Spain. And all that happened is small aggregators, which are sites that kind of create lists of links or search engines, couldn't afford these new hyperlinking fees, and so went under, which meant that smaller publishers didn't actually get the traffic directed at them, because these publishers weren't giving them the money, they weren't getting the traffic. Actually, it had a really strong negative effect. Economic reporting said that the publishers in Spain lost 10 million euros as a result of this law. So it seems like a good idea, but I think that in practice, it would actually only benefit the really big publishers and the ones who aren't actually really suffering as a result, the ones who already have a successful business model. It's small news industry, small magazine sites that would really suffer because they won't have the bargaining power in this situation to decide how these fees get shared, what kind of charges are made. And so it's actually just going to entrench the existing dominance of a few major news sites rather than increasing media plurality or access to the news, which is actually what we're concerned about at the end of the day.
Okay, can I ask you just one question? Of course, when we do a Google search these days, the Google returns the link responding to whatever you search for, but it also includes the headline of the page and some text from the page, usually surrounding the link text that you've searched for. As you understand it, would the link tax apply to that?
Only for news sites, but otherwise, yes, because this is really focusing about the news industry.
Okay. And do you see that this would have an impact on, for example, websites like, I know internationally, the Huffington Post and others, perhaps you might say the journal.ie in Ireland, that link a lot of their stories to other stories?
Yeah, actually it's really likely. It depends, of course, how it's done, but when you're sharing links like that, you could end up with a situation where there's a third-party organization set up that manages this. You usually have these collecting societies, which is the same way the music industry work. Mm-hmm. And they'd set up and they'd charge fees across the board and say, like, you've shared this many links, so you need to collect this money. And they take a cut, which is what always happens, and then they would distribute it back round to some publishers. And then the chance of it trickling back down to journalists is pretty small, and journalists we've spoken to are not very confident that they'll actually see any more return.
Okay, I want to move on to one other issue that's, I think, proposed in the same proposed directive. That's the content filtering on posts that ordinary people put onto websites. So people in Ireland will be very familiar with websites like boards.ie, and there's millions of these forums alongside, of course, major websites like Facebook, whereby people can post content. Sometimes they post content that's very objectionable. And as I understand it, am I correct that this proposal is to require websites to have some level of automated filtering to remove objectionable content? First of all, can I ask, what is it that they're proposing should be filtered?
So it's not about hate speech or bullying or any of those kind of big social issues. Once again, this is really just a copyright issue. And what they're proposing is that sites that allow users to create their own content, to upload content as they put it in the legislation, so that's things like Tumblr or Facebook, would have to create technology that filters and identifies content that's been identified by rights holders. So they're referring implicitly to content that's copyright infringing, but it doesn't actually say that. It just says content identified by rights holders, which means that, again, it's big companies who get to say, this is the kind of content that we don't want people posting, and it actually overrides like exceptions to copyright that we have in the law, things like fair use, fair dealing, like parody, like quotations, like when it's legitimate to use copyright content for criticism.
So, for example, on YouTube has had issues with this, whereby somebody makes a video with perhaps a political bent or with the intention of making some point, and they quote perhaps another video or something that they've downloaded from TV in order to make their point. That's absolutely legal within the copyright law, but the rights holder, who is perhaps the person being criticized, doesn't want to be criticized, so they launch a copyright claim against that.
That's exactly right, yeah. So it's applying the same kind of concept that's been applied to YouTube for the last few years on a broader scale across the whole web, and actually also making it worse than the existing YouTube Content ID system. So it's actually a pretty terrifying proposal because it's hugely sweeping, and it also just mandates this creation of a technology without any suggestion of where the money's going to come from for that. So it cost YouTube, I think, I'm trying to remember this figure, 60 million to develop Content ID. And you have to ask, like, how would a website like Wikipedia, for instance, which obviously involves a lot of directly user-created content, afford that. It's a non-profit initiative. And there are plenty of other sites, even sites like Reddit, would really struggle to have the same budget that YouTube has.
Can I ask you then, what do you think is the likelihood of this actually becoming law in the EU?
Well, at the moment, I've got high hopes that we might be able to fight it. I think the link tax one is definitely on the back burner, and MEPs are really realizing that there are a lot of people against it, and that's been really effective. The problem with the content filtering one is there's so much stuff written in the legislation that it's very hard to kind of work it out into making something that's possibly decent at the end of it. So we've got to really put a lot of pressure on to just make them drop it. I think it is possible, but that one's going to be a really tough fight, because if the people pushing these ideas lose one of them, they're going to just really double down on the other one. So we need to have a lot of public pressure over the next few months to make sure that it doesn't pass.
And where is that pressure targeted at?
So we're focusing on MEPs at the moment, because MEPs get a huge say in this. And also, they're the democratically elected part of the EU, which means that they really have to listen to their constituents. And that means there's a direct and obvious channel to put pressure on, to speak to them, and it's a chance for everyone to get their voice heard. Unfortunately, the other kind of major part of the EU that gets listened to is the European Council, but it's a lot harder for ordinary people to really speak to them in the same way. So that's why we think it's important people should write to their MEP and make sure they know that the public opposes these ideas.
Ruth Kustig-Deal, I see a link on your website, which I will post on the notes for this podcast, where people can contact their MEP to express their opinion about that. But thank you very much for talking to me about that.
No problem. Thanks so much.
If you liked the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
That's almost the end of episode 54 of Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, published on the 17th of February 2017. There are links to the original piece by Paul Reynolds and the transcript of the now disappeared piece by Philip Boucher-Hayes in the show notes for this podcast on the website. If you can think of a topic that should be covered in the next show, or if you want to suggest someone to include, and that could be yourself, then let me know. If you like the podcast, please go on iTunes and give it a rating, or even write a nice review. Also, please like the show on Facebook, follow the podcast on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, follow Open Media at Open Media ORG, and of course subscribe to the podcast so new shows automatically come up in your podcast feed. You can use iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast app or software. If you don't know how to do that, there's full instructions, recommendations for free podcast software, and contact details for the show. It's all at www.here'show.ie. The next show will be uploaded shortly. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.